to everyone to our third launch event of the Routledge Handbook of EU-Middle East Relations in the framework of the EU Jean-Monnet network also. In our previous two sessions, we delved into the history of these relations and theoretical approaches to analyze them. And today we are turning to Middle East-EU relations in the contemporary world. Now, in comparative politics, we often see it zooming in either into the Middle East or into Europe. But in this handbook and also this panel, we really look at both and also try to set them in context with each other. And to do so, we have been extremely lucky to have such distinguished academics on board. It really is an honor for me to chair this panel today with you. So we will first have about 1 hour of presentations for the 4 book contributions, which will be followed by half an hour of questions and answer. And so to our audience, you can post your questions in the chat box right away during the presentations, and I will then pick them up in the question and answer session. We are also registering this event and we will put it online as we get indeed many requests afterwards to watch this also. Now, as we have much to discuss, I will only very briefly present the panelists respectively before they speak. You can find their longer bios on the EACES homepage of this event series. Indeed, many thanks once more to the team at EACES for the excellent organization of this series. So first, we are turning to Andrea Teti, who is an associate professor of international relations and an associate editor of the journal Middle East Critique, and to Gennaro Gervasio, who is an associate professor at Roma III University. Their book chapter is titled Perceptions of the EU, Activists and Public Opinion in the Middle East. So please, Andrea and Gennaro, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniela, and thank you to everyone who invited us and made the work possible, which is, I think, a really important and interesting contribution to the study of relations between the EU and Middle East broadly writ. Our conversation, or our contribution rather, is going to be structured in the following way. I'm going to talk for about 8 or 9 minutes and not use any slides or overheads or anything, so we have our attention entirely focused on our conversation. And Gennaro may or may not intervene at the end to add a few elements to what I've been saying. And what our contribution tried to do is to try and look at an apparently specific empirical problem, which is the relationship of perceptions between the EU. How does the EU perceive itself as acting, in particular in relation to the promotion of democracy in the Middle East, and then how in the Middle East itself, with a specific focus on Egypt as an interesting topical and politically central case study, how it is that public opinion in general and civil society activists, pro-democracy civil society activists, perceive the European Union itself. And the reason why we're looking at this problem is because we think that there's an interesting pattern that emerges from the comparison of these self-conceptions and perceptions. To be very short, I won't bore you with going into detail of specific statistics or survey data or interview data, although Gennaro may want to say more about the interviews with activists later on. I want to focus on the core that emerges, the patterns that emerge from this analysis. On the one hand, if we look at the documentation that the European Union has produced since, well, before and after the Arab uprisings, to ask the question, how does the European Union see itself as promoting democracy? What kind of democracy does the European Union think it is a normative actor for, a normative power for? Then the answer emerges that although the rhetoric of the democracy being promoted, the self-identity of the European Union, focuses a lot around the so-called European social model, roughly speaking, what we know historically as a social democracy or social market democracy in the German inflection of that notion. That is the conception that's central to the European Union. When the European Union, in other words, promotes democracy, when it talks about promoting democracy and fundamental values, this is what it thinks it's doing. It thinks it's promoting, or it says it's promoting, the European social model, social democracy broadly writ. In fact, if you look at the details, what it is actually doing is promoting classical liberal democracy, a kind of polyarchic notion of what democracy is. In other words, you have elections every X number of years, a competitive selection of leaderships, etc. But what's missing from that picture is precisely what renders the European social model the social model. In other words, the social part of democracy. Okay. What's interesting about that is then that if you look at public opinion data, and if you look at, in our case, Egyptian activists, and you ask, what kind of conception do people have of democracy? Then it's exactly that socially rich democracy that emerges. It's democracy with social justice, a kind of a happy confluence, if you will, a convergence and overlap between conceptions. European social model on the one hand, and democracy with social justice on the other. And what's interesting about this is that it emerges, although of course each country is different and there are different, empirical realities in different Mediterranean, South Mediterranean countries, the countries of the so-called Southern Partnership. The pattern overall remains that. In other words, when people, if you ask people what they think about democracy, how they conceive about democracy, it is certainly civil and political rights, but it is also social and economic rights. It's certainly democracy in the liberal sense, but it's also democracy in the sense of social justice, right? That's at the level of the population. And Gennaro will say a little bit more about this in a second, but this is exactly also the kind of pattern that you find in representations from pro-democracy activists. So focusing on this pattern helps us understand why it is that we get the survey data results that we get on the perception of the European Union, its, so to speak, normative power. And we find that actually, if you ask people, what's your opinion of the European Union? Well, people don't have a great opinion of the, let's be honest. It's quite well known that, and also in Brussels circles, people are very well aware of the fact that there's a reputational deficit, especially in certain country contexts. Now, while there are a lot of other factors that go into generating that reputational deficit, it's also the case that this mismatch between what the European Union thinks it's doing when it's promoting democracy and what it's actually doing, that's what's generating, or that's what's helping to generate that, that misperception, or that correct perception, as it were. So I want to not say anything else about activists. What I do want to say is that there's some really important implications. We could say, okay, well, so the European Union is not promoting democracy and fundamental values as it says it should. That's not exactly news. That has been pointed out before. But what's important to understand is the implications of this for what the European Union's agenda actually is. For at least 7 years, the Union has focused on promoting stability first, even before democracy. That's a little bit controversial, but roughly speaking, I'd say that there's a consensus around this. In the belief that if we promote security first, then other things like development and democracy can happen. And then there are specific geopolitical rationales in contexts like Libya or Egypt, but by and large, the idea is first we set the table, as it were, and then democracy can come, which is exactly the same logic that the European Union used before the uprisings. The problem with this is that in order to do this, the way that the European Union is pursuing this causes it to have a pragmatic working relationship with a series of authoritarian, more or less intensely authoritarian, repressive regimes. And the economic policies that it adopts also worsen the kinds of problems of inequality, social injustice, etc., that led people to have a poor reputation, a poor perception of the EU, and to rebel against their own governments, as they did a dozen years ago or so. So what the European Union is doing is supporting regimes that appear stable by providing security guarantees or security support, energy deals, security deals, etc. While at the same time, the structural conditions for instability are actually increasing. So this is what we refer to elsewhere as a kind of brittle authoritarianism. It's something that looks like it's stable and strong, but in reality is not. It's being eroded from within, and you're never quite sure exactly when it's going to, in a sense, enter into a crisis, as it did in 2010, 2011, throughout the region. So this is the fundamental problem. These series of mismatches that we identify are important and interesting in themselves for specific sectors or areas like promotion of democracy, pursuit of stability, etc. But more broadly speaking, they point to a tension within the rhetoric and the practice of EU foreign policy, in this case in the southern neighborhood, a tension which is actually generative. It actually causes and helps reproduce the problems that it's supposedly trying to resolve, to address. So at this point, I will stop, and I will leave the floor if Gennaro wants to add anything on the activists that.
Yeah, just thanks, Andrea. Thanks to the editors and the organizer for the invitation. And when again, apologies in advance because I will have to leave the meeting at a certain point. Yeah, I mean, what actually the point that we made is exactly what Andrea was saying. I just want to add methodologically that whilst there are examples taken from literature on the uprisings from several countries, especially Tunisia, the fieldwork was conducted in Egypt, and especially in the category that also us, also with Pamela Abbott, the other author, inspired by Sheila Karapiko and others' works, called independent civic activist. And so the idea is that whilst, you know, the surprise of the magnitude of the uprising again was surprising, as said, there was a on the main causes of crisis of the ruling on the ruling regimes. I guess, you know, as Andrea was just saying, on the fact of they were not really hegemonic or strong regimes, but rather ferocious, so fragile. And actually, and a lot of this is especially what actually we highlighted is that the connection between economic, social, and political rights was clearly established. I mean, that the distinction among those was something that of course, in a way, let European Union have good relationship with some of the regimes that were then overthrown, or at least the heads, like the Mubarak regime, see all, especially how Madame Mubarak, Suzanne Mubarak, was courted and every now and then and praised. They received a lot of prizes, and the same happened in Tunisia for different reasons, especially pushed by Italy and France. So the idea that the economic rights are separated or could be dealt in a different way, it's something that in a way was clearly rebuked by activists well before, or at least in the eve of the uprising. So the idea that what are actually debatable rights open to discussion are in fact human rights from that sort of viewpoint. And therefore, whether it's true that most, you know, the so-called on the still ongoing debate on the uprising, the economic is important. I mean, the idea of separating that is also something that came before and after is back. Also, in terms of contestation of EU policies, let's not forget, and I think that you know, Andrea among others wrote about the confusing or the lack of change of policy, even in the moment of enthusiasm, let's say between 2011 and 2013 by the European Union. But in fact, the way that, you know, that sort of the distinction, or in a way obliterating what happened, to come back to make, you know, to go back to the old politics of, in a way of accepting of actually, and even promoting, I mean, like those regimes in the area, was back. And in the case of, in our case, For instance, the presence of some EU, again, aid of governments, including France and Italy, at the inauguration of the so-called extension of Suez Canal in July 2015, the race to secure Egyptian gas, which, by the way, is being renewed as we speak because of the Russo-Ukrainian war, there were clear signals that actually, rather than being confused, the EU had the clear, knew what it wanted, and it was not the democracy from the southern and eastern shore, and in particular was not very interested in listening on what the actual actors had to say. It might be like a over pessimistic conclusion, but in fact, in our contribution to the handbook, we leave it an open space for the EU to move. I mean, it's never too late to reconsider policies. And it's interesting because not only data, but also discourse, like looking at the EU documentation, that's quite clear. I hope that we didn't go over the time we had, so I'll stop here, and then for the Q&A, well, I will leave it to Andrea. Again, apologies, but I'm staying until I can. Thanks.
Well, thanks so much to both of you for presenting your excellent work based in surveys and interviews. And I'm sorry, Gennaro, but I had right away a question for you, which we can maybe, it's a short question, ask you because you have to leave later. It's from Michel Patch, who's in the audience. And the question is, if you could elaborate on what keeps European leaders from denouncing abuses and addressing Egypt's rights crisis under al-Sisi. Maybe in 1 minute, and then we turn to the next speaker, or shall we keep it for the Q&A for Andrea? Okay, we keep it for the Q&A for Andrea. Okay, good. So thank you very much. We will then turn to Ayhan Kaya, who is professor of politics at Istanbul Bilgi University. His book chapter is titled Populist Politics in Europe and the Impact on EU Relations with the Middle East, EU-Turkey Relations as a Case Study. Ayhan, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Daniela. Thank you very much for the organization and also for this great, opportunity to bring us together in this incredible volume on, several different interconnected issues, but certainly about the EU, about the perception of the EU from different, geographical locations and from a very critical perspective. In my contribution, I have used some notions, and if you allow me, I will elaborate a bit on those notions, starting with the term populism, and I used the term radicalization of political rhetoric in the European Union, as well as in Turkey, specifically focusing on the radicalization of political discourse among the right-wing populist parties and their followers on Islam, migrants, refugees, and the Middle East. On the other side of the coin, I also looked at the radicalization of political discourse within the Turkish case among the Justice and Development Party, the ruling party in Turkey, and its followers. And I framed these two different forms of radicalization from a civilizational perspective, arguing that there is an incredible process of co-radicalization between the populist formations, right-wing populist formations, i.e. right-wing populist parties in Europe and populist, right-wing populist formation, Justice and Development Party rule in Turkey. If you let me crystallize it a bit more, I argued that the right-wing populist parties in Europe are becoming more and more Islamophobist, while the Justice and Development Party is becoming more and more Islamist. So this is what I call the co-radicalization of Islamophobist versus and Islamist political formations in the EU and also in Turkey specifically. The term co-radicalization is a term that the psychologists have used recently very much. And I also use it in my continuing, ongoing European Research Council funded research project on youth radicalization in Europe, especially among the right-wing nativist populist youngsters on the one hand, and self-identified Muslim youngsters on the other hand. So in the paper, I continued to elaborate on the notion of populism, arguing that there are three major ways of understanding populism in social sciences. I will not go into detail, but basically, I specifically touched on the school arguing that populism is becoming more and more popular among those people who are called the losers of globalization. This is one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is that it becomes more and more popular among those who blame the political centers, among those anti-elitist people. And the third way of looking populism, especially right-wing populism in social sciences, is to understand it as a kind of political style. So saying that there are quite really interesting parallels between the political style of, let's say, Geert Wilders, of Donald Trump, of Recep Tayyip Erdogan, of Trump, etc., etc. So I also analyze the different approaches to understand what populism is. But basically, my understanding of populism is that populism, especially in the European context, becomes prevalent, especially in those politically, geographically, and ideologically remote places. Not in Paris, not in Amsterdam, not in Berlin, but in Dresden, but in Lyon, but in Rotterdam. This remoteness, not necessarily only geographical, but also ideational, ideological, and political remoteness is very decisive for us to understand the rise of right-wing populism in the European context. So after that, I worked on the politics of fear, which has been there actually in Europe since especially 9/11. I kind of analyzed the rise of the politics of fear in my chapter, referring to the 9/11 and its aftermath. But I discussed how the European public has, in a way, transformed itself in terms of defining its geographical other and ideological other since 1970s. And I claim that, well, actually, until let's say 1970s, the geographical other of the European public, in a way, was USSR, but it was replaced, especially after Arab-Israel war and the 1974 oil crisis. This other geographical other replaced with the Middle East because of the OPEC oil crisis, etc. And then there was also another very important transformation in the mindset of the European public in general. The communist ideology was previously the other of the European public. And then after 1974, especially when Habermas, used the term legitimacy crisis of the nation states in the European context, Islam became the ideological other of the European Western public in general. So I could see the transformation of the mindset of the European public in general in terms of the perception of geographical and ideological others. And I see that this confrontation is still there, and recently it has become expressed in a more civilizational way, which I also expressed in my intervention rather more. And then I also looked at the other side of the coin, that is the Justice and Development Party rule, uses civilizational rhetoric since it came to power in 2002, aligning itself with the European Union, with the West, and then later shifting its focus from the European Union to other parts of the world, like I guess many other international actors in the world. So in that sense, I specifically looked at the diaspora politics of the Justice and Development Party, promoting Islamist discourse in the European context, from time to time triggering the civilizational encounters between its immigrants and their children in Europe on the one hand, and of course the right-wing populist groups on the other hand. So as a way of conclusion, I came up with the argument that there is this strong civilizational rhetoric now in Europe, dividing the world into two boxes, Manichaean, Cartesian boxes. One is, us, and the other is, the other, basically. And this is based on this Islamophobist rhetoric. And I use the term Islamophobism in this case because I really strongly believe that it has rather become a kind of ideological position, especially among the right-wing populist party formations. And finally, I also questioned that, this civilizational rhetoric is very much to do with the ways in which European, ruling parties kind of accommodate Islam in the European context. And I argue that there is a kind of competition now on the definition of Islam by the receiving states on the one hand, trying to accommodate Islam using their own path-dependent models, which is civilizational, I argue. And on the other hand, there is another competitor there, which is the migrant sending states like Turkey, Morocco, Algeria, etc. They all have their own individual definitions of Islam. And finally, a third competitor in this sense is the states like Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Iran, trying to promote their own perception of Islam. And I think this is a kind of dead end because things are revolving around the definition of migrant origin people in Europe along the civilizational and religious lines. And I think this is a dead end. We need to find ways to go beyond this dead end. And I think, as far as I can see, the only way to go beyond this culturalist and civilizational and religious dead end is to concentrate on socioeconomic, political, and psychological drivers, which make people, express themselves. This was, in a nutshell, my intervention, dear Daniela. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Ayhan, for sharing your really interesting research with us. It has been a pleasure to listen to you. And in a question answer, I would be really interested to know what you think, how the Russian war on Ukraine and how Europe is reacting to this is impacting this shift that you spoke about from the 1970s. Maybe there might be another shift again now. So how this impacts the general public, but also populist parties in particular, who are in big problems now, I would assume. So that is already a question, but let's turn to our next speaker, who is Djallil Lounnas. He is a professor of international relations at the Al Aqwan University in Ifran. And his book chapter is titled Moderate Islamist Parties in the MENA region and Europe, between the democracy-human rights nexus and the stability-security nexus. Djallil, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello, everyone, and thank you, Daniela, for this wonderful adventure of this book, and Michelle, and it's good to see you finally. I mean, it's not only through emails, all of you. So indeed, my chapter was focused on the relationship between the European Union and actually what we call the Islamist parties who arrived to power in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, and basically how those relations have evolved. You can hear me? Yeah, okay. So how those relations have evolved over the period of 5-6 years between 2011 and 2016, 17, 18. Now, as you remember, in 2004, the European Commission, the European Union launched the European Neighborhood Policy, which was basically, the idea was to strengthen the relationship between the European countries and the South. One of the things is that, one thing that's important to mention is that the strategy was seen as strengthened by political parties in the South, the democratic political parties in the South, as having strengthened actually the authoritarian regimes in the Arab world. Okay, so there was like this perception that's important to underline. To that extent, in 2011, when you had the Arab Spring and change of regime in Libya, Egypt, Algeria, and Tunisia, if you want, the European Union was blamed for that. It is the idea that the European Union has supported regimes in place, authoritarian regimes in place. To that extent, if you want, 2011, the European Union focused on its relationship with the South on what they call the democracy-human right nexus, okay, sort of human right democracy nexus, where basically the European Union would emphasize on the development of the human right and democracy in Arab countries. Sorry, it's Ramadan here, so my throat is dry. My apologies for this. To that extent, at the same time, we had the arrival of the Islamist parties to power in 2011. Okay, the Islamist parties arrived to power in 2011 in the wake of the Arab Spring, Tunisia, Egypt, Morocco as well, the PJD, and coalition governments as well. To that extent, if you want, the EU was worried about that. Okay, what will happen? The history of the Arab world with Islamists, it's not exactly a good one. If you remember Algeria, the civil war in 1990s and so on. There was fear that those parties would actually endanger democracy, would put at stake the human rights. For example, with bringing the Sharia into replacing the civic law with the Sharia, by also replacing, it's trying to establish some Islamic states and so on. And as well, especially when it comes to human rights, the issue of women, how they will behave toward women. Okay, but the extent there was a lot of concerns. There were a lot of concerns on this issue. How did Islamists react? How did Islamic parties react to that? Actually, it's something that was unknown, but the Islamists had actually operated in the 1960s, 1970s, an important reform, okay, reform on the thinking, okay, political thought. It started in Egypt with the Muslim Brothers, and this is important here to underline. The parties that arrived to power in Egypt, Algeria, Tunisia, and even Morocco were Muslim brothers, okay, the Muslim Brotherhood parties. Okay, they derived the thinking from wasatiyya, which means moderation. Okay, wasatiyya or moderation, if you want. And if you want, already since the late 1960s, 1970s, they had endorsed the principles of democracy based on the concept of shura, which means consultation. They also endorsed the principle of ijma, keep the unity of the people, ijma, all go together. They also endorsed the idea that the role of the leaders was to do everything they could to improve the situation of the Muslims. If it meant going through democracy, it's also democracy. To the extent, if you want, the idea that politics and Islam were not contradictory had already been there since 1960s and 1970s. But the extent they endorsed democracy. The problem is how much, to which extent, When they arrived to power, actually, they proved to be extremely pragmatic. When they arrived to power in Morocco, Tunisia, and so on, they proved to be extremely pragmatic in the sense that they endorsed democracy principle, freedom of speech, and so on, especially in Nahda in Tunisia and PJD in Morocco. They went to the coalition governments and so on. From that point of view, to that extent, they met the European expectations. On the human rights issues, they did not implement the Sharia. Okay, they did not implement the Sharia. There was no attempt to put, for example, an eye cutting the hands and all those things that people feared. There was no implementation of Sharia. Rather, what they said, and this is based on interviews I conducted with people, with Islamists in Tunisia, Algeria, leaders of the political parties, and also Morocco, they said that they will actually endorse the positive law as long as it does not contradict the Sharia. To that extent, that was one move on their part. They also said that there's no need for them to go that far, to open that file so far, in 2011, 2012, 2013. To that extent, they're rather focused on social and economic issues which they dealt with, and rather than Sharia and religious issues. When it came to women issues, as the gender issues, women, actually, in case of Nahda, after some changes, after some theological changes, they endorsed equity and parity with women in the case of Tunisia. In Jordan, which was actually in Jordan, they even under the Islamic Action Front, actually even introduced quotas in the Secretarial Council to protect women and to actually have women representation. But at the same time, let's be honest here, they were very ambiguous. Okay? There was a lot of ambiguities when it came to gender and women. Okay? For example, in Tunisia, they refused to, they introduced laws which basically introduced the fact that women would have only half of men on heritage. Okay? In Egypt, for example, Morsi, who on the one hand said he would appoint a vice president as woman, he suppressed the quotas of representation for women at the National Assembly in Egypt. To the extent, if you want, there was a lot of contradictions and ambiguities on this issue. The thing is this. Starting from 2013, 2014, the situation went wrong. The situation went wrong from a security point of view. We got failed states in Libya, the collapse of Libya, the rise of Daesh, explosion of migration, and so on. And with that, the European Union shifted its focus, although there was no speeches. But when we interviewed, I remember 2014, 15, and 16, I interviewed EU officials in Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, all said, look, officially, we say we endorse democracy, we say we endorse human rights, but actually, we're more focused on security issues. They named all three, they named terrorism, migration, and stability as they are focused. They talked about all of them, security and stability. For them, democracy was a lesser issue, To that extent, they wanted to see how Islamist parties would behave on this issue. Again, here, the Islamist record on that is quite ambiguous. Tunisia, in the case of Tunisia, Nahda in 2011, 2012, 2013, actually supported discreetly the sending of foreign fighters to Syria and Iraq. Egypt endorsed the Morsi, did some things or some things like that, but above all, when it came to jihadists, he entered into a dialogue with them. Negotiations with them, especially in Sinai. To that extent, if you want, there's sort of ambiguities. The thing is this, and as you remember, I told you at the beginning, they said, I told you it's the Muslim brothers, Ikhwan Muslimin in Arabic, that actually endorsed the democratic political process. The Salafists who were involved, the ones who were involved with jihadists, made it clear that there's no way. There's no way that they will go to the political process. And actually, I interviewed a couple of members of Daesh. Something that shocked me. He said, why do they call themselves Ikhwan Muslimin? Ikhwan Muslimin is Muslim brother in Arabic. You change it, and a lot of people did this, in Khawana Muslimin. The traitors, the Muslim traitors. Khawana means traitors. Okay, they change it. Instead of Ikhwan, they use the word Khawana, traitors. To that extent, if you want. Then, starting in 2013, 2014, the jihadists entered the process of violence in Tunisia, we had in Egypt, attacks and so on, in Egypt, and so on. To that extent, if you want, based on this, the Muslim brothers eventually were forced to revise the strategies. 2014, 2015, political force toward jihadists. And to that extent, endorsed, if you want, security approach toward jihadists. This does not apply to Morocco in the sense that in Morocco, the security apparatus remained under the control of the king. To that extent, from 2011, 2015, there was no change when it came to fighting violence. Okay, security was tight on that. On the issue of migration as well, the Islamists proved to be extremely pragmatic. They endorsed the European Union approach. To that extent, for example, when they had negotiations with the Europeans, Islamist parties endorsed the trust fund that was established by the Europeans. They squeezed the controls. In Morocco, they called it criminalization. There was a criminalization of illegal migration and so on. To that extent, if you want, there was tight cooperation with them. Finally, of course, all this put together on the stability of the regimes in place. Okay, they ensured stability. Well, this does not come with a price, worth price. This did not come with a price. Those revisions on democracy, on gender, on jihadism, on that, and so on, the fact that was not able to provide concrete responses to the economic, social issues that the people had, led eventually to the collapse of the Islamist parties in Tunisia, in Morocco electoral system. In Egypt, you had the coup d'etat as well. That we witnessed. In Jordan, they didn't win. They lost actually also the elections. To that extent, if you want, this sort of normalization, quote unquote, the pragmatism that was part of this relationship of the European Union led eventually to the weakening, to the considerable weakening of the jihad, of the Islamist parties. That's basically what my part of my chapter is about. Donc, voilà, I'm ready for any questions. Again, my apologies, my voice is the Ramadan, and it's my voice is dry and whatever. Okay, so I'm very sorry about that, Daniela.
Thank you so much, Djallil, for another excellent presentation, really. And later I would be really interested to know indeed what you think will happen in Tunisia. Where what you're explaining is playing out right now in the political field. So thank you very much. Now, last but certainly not least, we now turn to Annette Jünemann, who teaches international relations at the Helmut Schmidt University in Hamburg. Her book chapter is titled Winds of Change, Negotiating Gender Relations in the Middle East and North Africa. Annette, the floor is yours.
Okay, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation, and I very much enjoyed being part of this book project. I thought everyone prepares a PowerPoint, and so I also quickly prepared a PowerPoint. I hope you can see it. Can you see it?
Yes, we can, thanks.
But how can I move it? We tried it out.
With the arrow on your tastatur, maybe?
Yes, it just worked, but now it doesn't work anymore.
Okay, it does. It just changed the slide.
It changed the slide, but it doesn't change the slide. Ah, yeah, now it starts. No, it doesn't. If it doesn't work, I go without. Ah, that.
It does, it does.
Okay, so that's it. Well, I want to start with a quote from Fatima Sadiki. Understanding women's agency cannot be achieved without understanding the sources of power and power negotiations in the regions. And this is really, in a nutshell, what I tried to deliver in my contribution. What I wanted to do is to shed light on the complexity of gender relations in the Middle East and North Africa, and thereby deconstruct stereotypes about the Oriental woman. And the stereotype is rooted in colonial times, but my impression is that until now, it shapes the perception of the region, of women in the region, in the European Union, in Western perception. And I want to do so by uncovering the political and socio-economic power structures that we find behind current gender discourses. My contribution is written from a post-colonial and from a feminist perspective. And of course, I'm a Western feminist myself, but I tried just to listen and to look what's going on in the region and keep my own position outside. The main findings sort of structure this elaboration on my contributions. First of all, gender policies are often used as an instrument in power struggles that have nothing to do with women's rights as such. And we just heard in the last contribution that moderate Islamist parties do it and regimes do it as well. We have a continuity from colonial times over decolonization until today in this approach to use gender policies as an instrument or a strategy in political power structures. It has an impact on the women's rights movement. It's not very united, it's not very strong, and I believe it's due to binaries that have historical roots. First of all, the secular versus religious identity divide. We have conflicts between generations, and very important, we have a socio-economic divide that splits not only society, but also women's rights movements. So I want to start with the instrumentalization of gender discourses for other reasons in colonial times. you all know that there was this approach that Europe is sort of perceived as the superior civilization that has a mission to civilize the backward Muslim or Arab civilization, and the Oriental women was sort of the symbol of the backwardness of societies in the Middle East and North Africa. And what they did is to have a women's liberalization top down, and top down means that it was sort of enforced on women. To give a very rough or hard example from Algeria, women from villages were dragged to the marketplace, and the wheel was taken off with force. And of course, this doesn't feel like liberalization. So actually, it was the start of the politicization of the wheel, because it became a symbol of resistance against colonial powers. In a nutshell, these top-down gender policies were an instrument to prove the superiority of European culture, and thereby to legitimize colonial power in the region. I argue that this goes on, this kind of state feminism, after decolonization. And if we think at the first president of Tunisia, Habib Bourguiba, he introduced in 1956 the really most progressive code of personal status, which of course was appreciated by women because it gave them more rights. But I argue that it was not really about women's rights, because if it was about women's rights, why were autonomous women's rights groupings suppressed that had existed before? And they were suppressed because they were much more radical and demanding, and they were a real opposition actor. And so there was too much fear of them. Whereas if it's top down, if women's liberalization is top down, then it sort of is under control. And this holds true until today. State feminism is an instrument to hold down Islamist opposition, and also a strategy to please Western donors. As long as Western donors have the impression that at least women's rights, if not other rights, or if there is no democratization, and if human rights are not an issue, as long as there is some window dressing on the gender issue, European donors find it okay. So this has an impact on secular women's rights movement, because in the past they sort of worked in strategic alliances with autocratic regimes, and they did so to defend women's rights against traditional concepts of political Islamism, but also to, within the authoritarian structure of the regimes, to sort of widen the room for maneuver for women. So many of them were co-opted by the regimes. We could talk about so-called gongos, governmental NGOs. To give an example from Egypt, the National Council for Women was presided by the First Lady, Suzanne Mubarak, and all the laws, gender laws, they were called Suzanne laws. And we have similar structures in the monarchies when it's a princess who would chair these kind of gongos, and that were always under the control of the regime. And this created problems after the Arab Spring, because then suddenly, although so many women participated in the Arab Spring, in these revolutions, at least secular women's rights groups were afterwards discredited for their proximity to the old regimes. And I think this is sometimes a bit harsh, because I think it was difficult for them to act without these strategic alliances. Of course, we would have to go into detail in every different countries. It's very sort of, I have to boil it down to these slides, but of course one has to look in every single case. What is not known in Europe so far is that there is also an Islamic Islamism, and there are very broad debates in the spectrum of religiously oriented groupings. To give only one example, very prominent example is Professor Fatima Mernissi. She is a sociologist from Morocco, and she started with a reinterpretation of the Quran from a feminist perspective. So they call themselves Islamic Feminists. And this is not to be, it's different from the female representatives of the Muslim brothers who went to parliament after Morsi took power after the Arab Spring in Egypt. They had no feminist agenda, but they simply held the same positions like male representatives of these parties. So one has to be very careful not to mix it all up. What we have are fierce debates between secular and religious groupings about gender relations. Should they be equal or complementary? Do we talk about women's rights or family rights? And the secular version is the equality between men and women, women's rights, and the Islamist notion is that there should be complementary rights. They are not the same, they are different, but they complement each other's. And at least from a Western perspective, family rights are less than women's rights. And of course, there are many, many positions in between. This is very rough what the debate is about. What I find very interesting that on both sides, you have generation conflicts that are often overseen. Young women in Islamist parties increasingly disagree with traditional concepts of gender relations. And these are not defended only by old men, but also by old women. And so we have young women who disagree and start critical discussions. And in the secular spectrum, you have young women who are increasingly skeptical with regard to Western role models, which shape the ideas of their mothers and grandmothers who often went to university in Paris or somewhere in the West. And maybe this is a chance for cooperation, unification, and empowerment of women's rights movements in the future if a new generation replaces the old generation. However, what makes me less optimistic are the socioeconomic binaries that are often overlooked and yet decisive. And they have a high impact, the high impact of social inequality in the region. Many of the secular women's rights activists have an upper or middle class background, and they're accused of being detached from poor and uneducated women. And since poverty is even more on the countryside, we have another binary between urban and rural spaces. So this helps explain why women's rights movement is not as united as it could be, because we have all these division lines. To conclude, gender discourses in the MENA region are extremely complex, much more complex than what I just told you. And they are shaped by historical, political, generational, and socioeconomic power struggles. It's too easy to explain the weakness of women's rights movements only with Islam, what is often done from a European perspective. And still the struggle with political Islamism, of course, has a high impact. But I think this holds true for religious fundamentalism also in Europe. I used to be Catholic, but as a woman and as a feminist, I found it too difficult to be Catholic. So I left it because we have the Catholic concept of gender relations actually is very close to complementarity and family rights. So there are not so many differences if you look at the isms, the ideological extremes in any religion. My impression is that there's little awareness in Europe about the complexity of gender discourses in the MENA region. I have been involved in when the Euro-Mediterranean Partnership started in the 90s. There was a lot about external democracy promotion from the side of the EU, and this included gender democracy. And I was quite active in these times, promoting gender democracy in the region and sort of teaching gender democracy in the region. And this was the lesson that I had to learn, that it's much better to listen than to teach. and this was, we just heard in the last, or also in Andrea's contribution, how civil society representatives from Europe were perceived with this, again, civilization mission that the European Union had when it started its Euro-Mediterranean partnership. There's a lot of post-colonialism, or there was a lot of post-colonialism in this concept. And so actually this contribution was written more for a Western European audience, because as I said before, I don't think I have to tell Arab women anything about gender discourses in the MENA region. Thank you very much for your attention. And I'm looking forward to your questions and critique.
Well, thanks so much to you, Annette, for the great input to our discussion and for also sharing your own positionality on the issue. And I also very much liked that you stressed all the time that we need to listen rather than teach. I think that has been coming through in this discussion today a lot too. So we are perfect in the timing. Thanks again to all speakers. Goodbye, Gennaro. We will pose all questions for the first. Goodbye. Thank you, Gennaro.
Good luck. Bye.
Bye. So we already have some first questions in the boxes. So I will right away start with them. So one question from Paul Arts to Andrea. Your analysis is very convincing, but can you maybe also shed some light on alternative EU policies, i.e. prioritizing economic and social rights? Perhaps you can use as an illustration the case of nowadays Tunisia. Try to be concrete as possible, please. There was also another question by Michelle to the presentation of Andrea and Gennaro. Shall I repeat it, Andrea? A microphone?
Maybe for the audience, but I'm fine. I wrote it down. I have it in front of me.
Oh, okay. Yes, I mean, for the audience, I'm trying to find the question. Where did it? Yes, what keeps European leaders from denouncing abuses and addressing Egypt's right crisis, also under EACEA? There is another question to Ayhan from Michelle. Maybe Michelle, you can actually directly intervene. I think it makes more sense because you also had another question. So, yes?
Perhaps we should give chance to Andrea to answer because he has two questions.
I think we can collect a few questions and then I would go back to all panelists, actually, if you agree.
That's fine. I actually have a question to all. I just want to thank all our presenters today. I enjoyed this this presentation session as much as I enjoyed reading your work as we went through the process of the handbook. So thank you once again. It's been really a pleasure to have you all. Apart from the question I had for Andrea and Gennaro, I did want to ask Ayhan, perhaps if you could tell us something about the efforts in terms of the EU's dialogue and engagement with Islam, especially in the context of the Mediterranean, particularly since the Arab uprisings. I think we are aware that the EU has developed a couple of approaches and pathways to try and at least comprehend Islam, but mostly in terms of intercultural and interreligious dialogue and engagement. So I wonder what you make of these existing efforts, whether they give us some opportunities or do they further challenge the EU's efforts in this regard? Thank you. And then I have a question for Djallil. Thank you again. I'm just wondering again, because probably due to time limits, you didn't have time to extend on this, but there's been an appalling silence, at least from an official EU level, in terms of any attempts at extending an open arm of dialogue with Hamas in Gaza, which was, after all, democratically elected in 2006. I wonder what your thoughts are about this and how this silence impacts on developments in regards to the Palestinian issue since then, in particular, please. And then to Annette, again, thanks for your lovely presentation. I I just wonder, perhaps this is extending your work a bit from the handbook, but what you make of Silva Walby's theorization of the relationship between modernization and gender regimes, where she sees this as an examination of, the evolution over time. And I like in particular the manner in which she distinguishes between the private patriarchy of the family, what she refers to as the domestic gender regime, and the public patriarchy of the state, which she calls the public gender regime. I'm just wondering whether this could be a model to help us nuance at a deeper level issues relating to gender discourses in the context of the MENA region, please. Thank you.
Thanks a lot to you, Michelle. And I would add a last question to Annette Jünemann from Raffaella del Sarto. Do you see any parallels in the use of gender politics in the MENA and gender politics in Europe? So we have a lot of questions here, and so we have all the time for the panelists to elaborate. I will go in the speaking order. So I am first to Andrea.
Okay, thanks. That's a bunch of really interesting questions and actually quite closely connected with the others. And Michelle's last question was also, relevant in this case, or rather, why, not just why the silence on, the EU silence on MENA regimes, autocratic abuses, but then the other side, of course, the flip side of the coin is why the silence in the support of democratic forces, or in any case, alternatives inside these countries as well. I think that's important. It goes to her first question, which was, what's preventing EU leaders from speaking out on the abuses of people like Sisi? And of course, you can, change the context, and you can have a permutation of the question. There are various factors, and the conversation could be long, as we all know. I think in part there's genuinely a question of the perception of security, the type of security that's perceived in policymakers' minds, and the conception that is very orthodox. It's human security, etc. It seems to be focused on hard security, at least since 2015, possibly since 2013. But I think that transition period, between the coup d'etat in Egypt and then the appointment, election, whatever you want to call it, of Sisi in Egypt, that's also a period in which EU language shifts quite significantly in relationship to the balance between, which there's always been a balance between, democracy, development, and security in EU foreign policy since its establishment, the Maastricht Treaty, and so on. But what changes is how these are conceived and how the relationship is conceived between them, which comes before the other. You could say, is it the chicken or the egg? But there you go. So I think on the one hand, there's a genuine question of a very orthodox, very hard, conventional, frankly outdated conception of security. On the other hand, I think lurking underneath all of this is the question of migration, right? Because in order to have a different message on a series of issues, from security to development, etc., one of the things that you need to do is change the European language on migration. Which would actually be in the European Union and member states, most member states, self-interest. Because if you think about the demographic and economic structures inside the European Union, particularly aging populations, tax bases, etc., immigration is a very obvious solution to all of that. And yet it's exactly what is being, On the other hand, and this goes to Paul's question, who I say hi to, even though I can't see, the economic policies that the European Union has been pursuing before and after the uprisings have directly contributed to one of the major push factor, if you want to talk about it in terms of push factors, but what has consistently driven people's intention or consideration of migration, temporary or permanent. You see this coming out of survey data all the time. You may have guessed I have a not very orthodox approach to survey data. But it's very clear that one of the major, and it's not surprising at all, one of the major causes of people considering or actually emigrating, whether temporarily or permanently, is socioeconomic injustice, inequality, etc. So this brings us to Paul's question, which is, okay, so what can we concretely do about it? Okay, as I've been saying for the last probably about 12 years, if not more, we can start by actually promoting by following the letter of the policies that we have in the European Union, right? So for example, when the European Union says that it promotes indivisible human rights, then okay, let's take that seriously, and let's not only promote civil and political rights, but also social and economic rights. I hear you ask, which social and economic rights? Okay, here's a couple of them, which also, it's unfortunate that Gennaro's not here, but they also emerged from interviews that we did in Egypt. And again, last summer we did with some other colleagues, Pamela Abbott, Sarim Khan, Ilyas Ipolia at Aberdeen, interviews in Tunisia. And, you know, and one of the things that emerges is labor organization, so unions, right? And the precarity, the quality of work, okay? So at the moment, what you have, and again, continuity, which is very clear before and after the uprisings, the European Union, either directly through member states or through international financial institutions, it asks recipient countries, beneficiary countries, whether it's grants or loans, to restructure its economy in certain directions, right? And the directions are pretty classic. It's flexibilization, which are deregulation of labor markets, etc. Classic Washington consensus, neoliberal policies. There is enormous evidence, it's incontrovertible now, that this kind of policy has led to a deterioration in the number and the quality of jobs. Okay, and that has a series of impacts sociologically, politically, etc. So, you know, if you're doing something that's not working, it's probably a good idea to stop doing that thing, okay? Because then that also, and again, this is in the self-interest of the European Union, because if you think about where migration or the drive to migration is coming from, it's coming from exactly this. Of course, it's not the only factor for sure, but it's a pretty big contributing factor, right? And this is, again, extremely well known. It's not as though this is not well known, okay? And then I want to say one final thing, which is in relation to security. There seems to me to be a particularly masochistic tendency amongst European policymakers, primarily in France, Germany, and Italy. And I'd say, well, it's a competition between the three, right? To attempt to, on the one hand, increase the hard security or hard stability in their own, from their own perspectives and their own way of looking at things in the Mediterranean by doing things that actively undermine it, right? The best case of this, well, there's a whole series of arms and intelligence deals between France and Italy on the one hand, Libya, Egypt, etc., right? But the most striking case was when the Italian government literally took out of the Italian Navy's hands 2 frigates, 2 FREMs, and sold them to Egypt in a way that actually cost them the money. And these were the beginning of a project or a process of major upgrading and modernization of the Italian Navy, which was deemed to be by the Navy itself, as well as by the government, as being in extremely poor shape, which, by the way, has reemerged this year when we're talking about the kind of Russo-Ukrainian war, okay? So I would say that the short and easy answer to Paul's question is, 1, start doing what the policies say, support all human rights, indivisible human rights. And that means the ones that you don't particularly like supporting in the first place, right? You, the European Union, of course, not Paul. 2, stop doing things that produce evident harm and clearly go against European self-interest, namely social and economic dislocation. 3, in terms of security, if you believe that the European Union needs to bolster its security position in a conventional way, then start with the European Union. Don't start with countries which are direct competitors in that space, right? And not at all reliable proxies, as Italy and France seem to think that Egypt is, Sisi's Egypt is. I think I'm not missing anything. I think
yes,
that's it.
Yes. Thanks, Andrea. So let's turn to Ayhan next.
Thank you, Daniele. Just try to be very brief. The first question is about the impact of Russian war on Ukraine, how it affects the ongoing discussions of civilizational rhetoric and the perceptions of Europe in the Middle East, especially in Turkey. Unfortunately, I mean, the latest discussions revolving around the reception of Ukrainian refugees by the European states, especially by the East European member states, is of course causing a lot of discussion in Turkey as well as in the other parts of the world. We keep hearing statements from different actors, questioning how on earth, such a civilized nation composed of white, blue-eyed people can be subject to such a war, such an invasion, as if it is no problem. There's no problem if something similar happens, to the Syrians or to the Iraqis, etc., etc. So here we see the production of this civilizational rhetoric, which has already been there, especially after 9/11. But also, of course, I mean, we should also be aware of the fact that in the Turkish context, we could also question the same thing, because I argue that the Turks would not be that receptive if, let's say, the Syrians coming to Turkey since 2011 were predominantly Christian. So you see, Christians received by Christian nation states, and the Muslims in Syria accepted by Muslim nation states. This clearly depicts that there is this very strong civilizational element as far as the reception of refugees in this part of the world, at least, is concerned. So, unfortunately, it seems to me that EU is in a way hijacked by the Eastern member states, which are mostly being ruled by right-wing populist parties, using this civilizational religious discourse very strongly, unfortunately. But then, as I told you, I mean, this would be exactly the same in the Turkish context under the Justice and Development Party, which is also a very right-wing populist formation. So the second question by Michel, yes, EU has been very much promoting this intercultural, interreligious dialogue over the last 2 decades, I should say. And even, I think, since the 1990s, since the war in Bosnia, which led to the coining of the Huntingtonian paradigm of clash of civilizations. Since then, I think we are still living in the same political climate, which is highly shaped by this civilizational paradigm, clash of civilizations or alliance of civilizations. Anthropologically speaking, there's no difference between the two, because both approaches civilization, both clash of civilizations claim and alliance of civilizations claim promoted by the UN are not really different from each other, because both are reducing civilization into religion, right? And from our, from the 19th century, sociology, from the 20th century anthropology, civilization was meant to be something different. If you ask me, there is one civilization that is kind civilization, right? And it is like a big ocean, and the cultures, religions are like those rivers feeding into this huge ocean of humankind, huge civilization of humankind. So, I'm an anthropologist, but I think that there is too much culture involved. But culture, by culture, what I mean, it's not the dynamic perception of culture, but rather static, essentialized notion of cults, which are becoming more and more decisive in the rhetoric of intercultural or interreligious dialogue. And I think it's too neoliberal. There is too much emphasis on culture, on religion, on civilization. This is something that I think this is also meaning that we have forgotten about what is really lurking behind all these conflicts, all these fights. If you ask me what is lurking behind all these conflicts is socioeconomic, political disparities. But this neoliberal logic is imposing on us that there is this continuous fight, let's say, between the crescent and the cross, which is a big lie. But unfortunately, this rhetoric that saying that there is a ongoing fight between the, let's say, cross and the crescent is unfortunately attracting millions of people in this part of the world. And the ones who have started this actually civilizational fights between, let's say, the crescent and the cross, were unfortunately the mainstream political parties in Europe. I remember those discussions back in the 2000s promoted by the mainstream ruling parties about there is no place for Islam in this country, like Germany, I remember, or anti-multiculturalism discourse again in many countries, France, Germany, UK, etc. And all these anti-multiculturalist discourses, as well as Islamophobic discourses, which were originally coined by the mainstream political parties, are now being instrumentalized by the right-wing populist parties. And this conjuncture, unfortunately, is leading the mainstream political parties to become even more right-wing than they were before. And so I'm really personally ashamed to see this ascendance of great replacement rhetoric in France, as well as in the other parts of the world, even promoted by people like Pécresse or Macron or so, I mean, there is a danger here. You know, there is too much religion, there is too much culture. So we need to go back to our focus, which was supposed to be socioeconomic, global injustices, disparities, and inequalities. This is my thing. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much. In a way, maybe it also gives an answer to Paul Art's question, I think. Let's move next to Djallil Lounnas. I just read very briefly for our video registration the question that you wrote in the chat answer so that it remains on the video. For Djallil, why the EU silence on Gaza attacks, including the recent attacks, while there is a massive support outpouring for Ukraine that focus on territorial integrity, sovereignty? Why the EU Parliament silence on this? How relevant is the current stream of foreign fighters from Africa and other states represents a legitimate threat to EU security, and how does their involvement comprise or threaten to compromise the safety of the region? Are the numbers significant enough to pose a threat? If so, what kind of threats are we talking about? Djallil.
Okay, thank you, Michelle, for your question earlier on Muslim Brother, and thank you, Sarah. Actually, Sarah was my former student of mine, the one who asked this question, so I haven't seen her in years. So actually, I was surprised to see you, Sarah. To hear from you. So to respond quickly to the question of Michelle and on the Muslim Brotherhood, on the Hamas, Hamas does actually pose a problem for what we said earlier. I mean, Hamas is a Muslim Brotherhood organization. It's a movement that has been participated in elections for years, and to that extent, I mean, also it's anti-Salafist, anti-jihadist. I mean, they have been fighting ISIS in some groups in Gaza. The thing is this, to go straight forward to the response. The thing is that Hamas has been involved in violence and has not renounced violence against Israel. As you know, Israel is a major part of the EU. There's a complex relationship. We met. We know that it's well known that to that extent. I mean, for the EU to establish relationship, dialogue, or whatever with Hamas, it would be very difficult to justify this, given that Hamas is considered as a terrorist organization and still uses violence against Israel. At the same time, there's also a problem of legitimacy. Let's say that Hamas controls the Gaza Strip. The EU considers that the representative of the Palestinians is the Palestinian Authority, the PA, Palestinian Authority. Extent also in which with which the Hamas is a total conflict. But extent, I mean, you got a double problem into that question. Do you enter into dialogue with Hamas, even based on pragmatic, or you don't? Having said so, let's be clear here. There have been like some contacts. I mean, there have been some contacts between the Hamas and the EU over the last years. The Hamas has been trying to reach out to the EU. We know that there have been a meeting in 2020 in Doha between the International Crisis Group representative Robert Malley, and also recently in Switzerland, where former EU representatives met with Hamas people in Switzerland. To the extent, I mean, this, it's a quagmire in a sense. I mean, you should be entering into a dialogue with them. To which extent, how much, why, and how would the PA Palestinian Authority react? That's also a major problem here. I think. I don't know if that's a response to your question, Michelle. Anyway. Yeah, not really. Okay. Now, regarding the question of Sarah, any questions on the? Can see it? Can read it out. Africa was a states who present a legitimate threat to security. But in North Africa, we do have, like, there was foreign fighters going to Ukraine. This is what you're referring to, Sarah. There was Algerians, Moroccans, and Tunisians that actually volunteered to go to fight on the side of Ukraine. But this created problems between Ukraine and the North African countries. The reason is that, number one, I don't think, I've seen some of them. I don't think that those foreign fighters, volunteers of North Africa are sincere about that. I mean, they offer citizenship, they offer permanent residence in Ukraine and so on. The people we met, we've seen some of them, and I have friends in Algeria who contacted them as well, as volunteers. They're actually more interested in that. It's a way for them to migrate. The idea for them is to go to Ukraine, from Ukraine actually to flee the battlefield and to go to migrate to Europe. To the extent, the question, how much do we trust those volunteers? I'm not sure about that. Second, it created a lot of problems with local governments because, the Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia have been dealing with foreign fighters issues for years, and for the past few years, it has been decreasing. Okay, they've managed to decrease in foreign fighters. To the extent, Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia do not want to see any kind of foreign fighters, locals going to Europe. Now, for Europe, I think it's a major issue. I was in Montreal 3 weeks ago for a conference. I was invited to a conference, and basically the theme of the conference was this question you raised, Sarah. How about the threat of the foreign fighters going to Ukraine? What can we learn from the North African experiences? Okay, and for the EU, that's one of the questions were raised. And if we're based on our, I don't know, what's the foreign fighters who go to Ukraine specifically? I don't know about that. But if we do, we believe that a lot of people, volunteers, are some of them are from the extreme right, go to the camps, they're trained, get military training, and so on. And you may have a problem based on our experience. Okay, you've got. If we hear what we say, if we believe what we say, some people. In Canada, it's not. It's a lot of people are from extreme right. I heard that in Europe it was from the extreme right. If you go to Ukraine, you train in extreme right camps. You get the ideology. You get military training. You get networks. You get international networks. That's the experience of North Africans. To that extent, that could be potentially a problem, security threat for the Europeans. That's something that I think needs to be underlined. Okay, I don't know if that responds to your questions. Thank you.
Well, I think that excellently responded to the questions. Thanks, Djallil. Annette.
Okay. I will start with Rafaela's question, which is easier for me to answer, and then go to Misha's questions. Rafaela's question was, do you see any parallels in the use of gender politics in the MENA and gender politics in Europe? Well, I think one parallel is that gender issues are misused, instrumentalized. In Europe, it's instrumentalized to discredit Muslim countries, Arab countries, and Muslim minorities within European societies. So they play off gender issues against. Well, we just heard from Ayhan a lot about Islamophobia, and gender discourses are misused in this context. Binaries I do think we also have socioeconomic divides in Europe. We have a very distinguished discussion on LGBT rights, and there are people who would claim that this is sort of detached from the problems of women who feel socioeconomically deprived. And so we have this divide. Is this an issue for the whole of society, or is it sort of middle class, upper class problem? This is again used by the right-wing parties and groupings to discredit feminism as such. I think the division line in Europe is not between secular or religious groupings, but between liberals and extreme right-wing groupings and parties. So in those democracies that I would claim are still real democracies, there's less state feminism because you have feminists in parliaments and governments. But it would be very interesting to have a closer look at gender discourses in gender politics in illiberal democracies like Hungary or Poland, where you have these right-wing populist parties in power. But I'm not very acquainted with these discourses in Eastern Europe. So yes, there are parallels, but the actors are different in parts. And Michelle's question, actually, I don't know neither the person nor the theory you talked about, but if I got you right, the question was on the impact of domestic gender regime cracks on the public gender regime. Is this correct?
Sorry, very quickly, if we have a distinction between the public gender regime and the private public regime, would that help us nuance more and understand more gender issues, and not just in the MENA region, but I think in other contexts as well? I think conceptually it's an interesting, differentiation.
Well, I think, well, first of all, it's universal. I couldn't see why it's something typical for the MENA region. I think in the 60s, we already claimed that the private is political, and meant is exactly this, that private gender relations have a political impact and cannot be perceived detached from the public level. And I think they interrelate very strongly. If you have cracks in the domestic gender regime, then automatically it impacts on the public gender regimes, because this changes power relations. And if power relations are changed on the domestic private level, it of course impacts on power relations in society, because then women start to demand for participation, economic participation, political participation, and it all starts with changing power relations in the private. And so, but it's difficult to discuss because we don't know if we talk about the same thing. If I got you right, I would say, yes, it's universal, and yes, it must always be looked at together. One does not go without the other. But I don't know if this answers your question. And I don't know whether I answered Rafaela's question. If not, please ask again.
Well, I think it covered both questions, and also, I mean, this has been a wonderful discussion, and I think we could go on for another hour. But we have, in fact, the next event on 11th of May, which is on peace, security, and conflict in the Middle East. So we can, of course, continue our discussion there, and that event will be also held together with Carnegie Middle East Center. And yes, so I close the session here, but a big thanks again to all our contributors. This has been a really excellent discussion, and well, I hope to also see you in our other events. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.